Hello, everyone, and welcome to PAEA's December webinar. Tonight, Johanna Marshall from Chesterbrook Academy will talk about how to incorporate sewing in the art room. Registered participants will receive a Google Form link via email in a day or two to fill out for their 1 hour of Act 48 credit. This webinar will be recorded and available at a later date on the PAEA website. Before we begin the webinar, we are asking participants to mute their microphones and keep their video off. Those controls are located in the bottom left corner of the controls bar. We are also asking everyone to sign in on the chat roll. Please use the same name in which you registered for this event. The chat roll can be found along the bottom in the controls bar as well. Signing in will ensure that you receive the Act 48 link. So let's get this webinar rolling. Johanna, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jill, and I'm so excited to be here and to get to talk to you about one of my favorite things to do and to teach, which is sewing in the art room. So I'm Johanna Marshall. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my keynote to share with you. And here are a few images to start with of what sewing in my art room has looked like over the years. And I do want to give the caveat that, of course, I'm giving an Instagram version of the successes that my students have had. And I don't typically share the catastrophic failures that all of us come across sometimes. So in sharing all of this, I do just want to be plain that we have plenty of mistakes and mess ups, and I'm going to share some of the things that we've really enjoyed that have been successful. So let's start with talking about why sewing. Why is it important? Especially because fibers can be, it seems like it might be a lot of prep work. We might not all feel prepared with the expertise going into it that we need. But sewing is a really important thing to teach students. It's a kinesthetic activity. I know that at my school, I have a lot of students with learning disabilities and different identified needs. And particularly with my students who have ADHD, sewing is a kinesthetic activity that really reads to them. It's something that's a full body activity. They can feel really successful, totally engaged. It helps them focus. It's something that's a guaranteed hit. Sewing is for every learner. Every type of person coming from every background can sew. Sewing is for everybody. It's everybody's heritage, and everybody deserves to get to do it. It's also STEAM learning. It's a really good fit into anything with a design challenge, anything where students are really mechanically inclined, anybody who likes to have things in their hands and figure out how things work. Sewing is a great fit with them. There are lifelong applications to it. There isn't any point, no matter how long you do it, that you're going to say, well, I've done it all, or I've thought through all the ideas. There's just always more, and there's always more to learn, more people to connect with, more to come up with. It's for every age of person. The image that's on the right is a project that I did with my pre-K students. And this is something that you could do all through K to 12. You could do it with adult students. It's just for everyone. And the biggest reason to do sewing in the art room is joy and engagement. People love it. Students just absolutely enjoy having it in their hands. They enjoy mastery of each thing as they go, and it is a guaranteed hit. So we're going to start by talking about hand stitching, which if you've never sewn before, that is totally okay. There are two different kinds. One is hand stitching, which like this is a needle and thread in your hand. And the other kind that we'll talk about in a little bit is machine stitching. So some things to have on hand when you're getting a sewing program started in your classroom is a good pair of sharp scissors. You will want some thread, yarn. If all you've got is some string, totally okay, whatever you've got. Needles, the kind that I start with younger students are the kind you can see on the bottom left here, these really blunt plastic darning needles. It's not a huge investment to make if they get lost, and they're not terribly dangerous to give out to students either. So those are a really good one. You can also see up here on the top right that we also use smaller hand sewing needles too, if you have older students. At some point you might find that you want pins to hold 2 layers of cloth together, and you can sew on fabric, paper, or mesh. Again, you don't need to make a huge investment to get started, so whatever you've got at the ready is going to work. So some organization tips in getting started. You're going to find that organization is key in setting this up. One thing that I like to do is cut all of my yarn or thread in advance. When we're doing younger kids and it's yarn, just cutting it all like this really helps me feel like I've got it started. I'm not going to have to stop mid-lesson and cut some more thread or anything like that. It's all ready to go. I also like to have a docking station with threaded needles. My students are pretty used to being able to get up and move around the art room, so they can come over independently as they work. If they've used up one needle's worth of yarn, they can grab another one. And you know your students best, so you might find that it's better in your room if you label or number all of those things, whatever works for you. I also like to partner students by ability. So if I have one student who is really new to motor skills or who struggles, I might make a point of seating them next to a student who is really good at tying their shoes, or is a really terrific fine motor person, or for some reason just loves knots. Then that's a good person to seat next to them, and that way they can help each other out if they need to wait a moment before I circle back and help them. One thing that I know you're going to come up against right away is that students will pull the needles right off of their thread. And especially if they're little, they're going to have a hard time putting it back on. So I'm going to share one innovation that I've been really delighted by, which is that I took, again, just some things that I had in the classroom and I made needle threaders for them. So the picture that I've just put up is some florist wire and some beads that I had around. I made a loop with those, and I made the students their very own needle threaders. So the way that these work is that you put that loop of wire right through the eye of the needle, put the thread through that, and pull it back through. And that way, even if they pull it off, they can put it back on and keep working on their own. And the other thing that you're going to want to make sure to do is to plan for early finishers. Some kids zoom through a project, and some kids get to 5 minutes through and they say, okay, I'm good and done for now. And you're going to want to keep those hands busy while you're helping somebody else. So I made one set of, again, using things that I had in the classroom. I had some extra blocks, so I drilled holes in them. I put a cord through those with a knot at either end so that students could do tying practice. If knots are new to them, or if they are the kind of kid that just loves fiddling with string, you can put these in front of them and they're going to be engaged in those for quite a while. Those would also work perfectly well with cardboard, as would the sewing cards that I made, also out of wood, just by drilling holes in them. Sometimes those are out as a finisher center or an optional center, and sometimes I give those to students who need some extra practice before they get started really using a needle on cloth. So let's talk about an introductory project that would work for any age. This one is learning to stitch, and all you need for this is some heavy paper that you've put hole punches in. You could give them a needle if you want them to do needle practice, but I usually just give them yarn. Again, there's a knot at one end so they can manipulate that through the hole, and that is all they need. So a sewing card just looks like this, and all that you need to do is teach the running stitch. Now there are two basic hand stitches that we're going to talk about. The running stitch, and if you have sewn before, you're familiar that this is the first one you learned. It just means that your yarn goes up through one hole and down through the next one, and repeat all the way around. That's the running stitch. And that's the first thing that you want to teach the students. You could decide that you want to stop there, or if your students are game for it, you could go ahead and teach them the back stitch. And the back stitch is really cool because instead of a dotted line, this makes a solid line. So a lot of things that they might want to do later on can be based on that. At the end, I'm going to do a demonstration. So I'll show, if you haven't seen the back stitch before, that's when I'll show you how to do it. This is what my students' work looks like. These students are 6 years old. They're in first grade. So I like to do our work just in short bursts so that we stay engaged the whole time. So after they've done the running stitch, we have markers and things out. They can go ahead and decorate that and just totally make it their own. If you want to make a bigger project based on the same premise, the way that we've done this is, as you can see, we did a watercolor crayon resist. I did the same thing, just punching holes, and then the students backstitch hearts as string art for that we were making for a holiday. All right, if you're ready to level up and stitch on cloth, here's how to get started. This is, of course, one of many directions that you could go. And this is something that I've just completed with some of my students who started with sewing cards. So if you have embroidery hoops available to you, they are really handy, but if you don't, that is also okay. It works perfectly well if you just masking tape some cloth to your art tables. So the way that I've done this is to trace an image outline on burlap. You might do it for them, or if they're older, they can do it themselves, and then backstitch along that outline. So that looks like this. And then when they're done with that, we do something that we call drawing with yarn, which of course is just doing their own style of combining running stitches and back stitches into creating new patterns, new ideas, just like we talk about combining lines, combining shapes when we're drawing. We talked about doing the same thing in yarn. And these students, you can see that the image on the left, that is last year when they were in kindergarten. We were not very worried about them combining anything or making an image. We were just making lines however we saw fit. And it's those same students who are pictured there on the right. They just finished those this year in first grade. Those are their first initials. The next project that I'm going to talk about is applique and buttons. And so just like the last one, this is a surface design project. Applique just means that you're putting another layer on top of your cloth and stitching it together. So here is a student doing that. What he's got here is a piece of felt. Felt is really handy because once you cut it, it doesn't fray, so it's really easy to work with. It's pretty stiff. And he is sewing that on. It's the trunk of a tree. And then we made those tree trunks into button trees. It seems like an important life skill to me that everybody learned to sew on a button, so I made it into this project. So they would always know how. Once they learn to do that, you can see that the one in the middle, the button trees, are a little bit more a project that I directed when I let them free to do their own things. The one on the left is a little bit more of a student-directed look coming out there. They used felt in this case because they could easily cut it, and they sewed it, and you can see a few tabs on there holding on keychains so that the students could walk away that day with a completed project. So now I want to talk about machine stitching, and I also want to pause at this moment because one thing that has always come up in talking to parents or administrators or other educators about sewing is someone usually asks me something along the lines of, how do I make this fun for boys? Or how do we make a project that boys would be interested in? And I will tell you that in my nearly 20 years of teaching kids to sew, there have only been a handful of instances in which anyone during the project mentioned anything about it being a gendered activity. And every time that that's happened, it's actually been an adult who's come in and said something like, oh, even the boys like it. But of course they like it. You get to use machines, you get to make things like toys or things that you can wear. You get to learn how to make really interesting things. And most kids don't get to do stuff like this. Most of the time, if there's a machine, they're supposed to stay away from it. So getting to have this in their hands is actually really exciting for everybody. I'm going to send out a shout out to Janome, who makes these really cool machines. We were really lucky to get 2 of them in my classroom. And they make these machines that are really kid focused. There's only one speed that the foot pedal goes. And there's a big plastic bumper around the needle. So no matter how hard you try, you cannot possibly stick your finger under there. And you can't get the machine going too fast. The dials are also kind of simplified, so students can really easily learn how to use the machine themselves if they're so inclined. And they are. It's really fun. So this is the sewing center that I've set up in my classroom. And I know it looks neat and tidy, But just to be clear with everybody, if you're setting up a sewing center, please don't feel like you need to have this huge space in your classroom allotted to it, because mine is under some class shelves and you can see there's storage underneath. And sometimes we need to use this table for other things. So when the sewing center is set up, this is what it looks like. So a few of the things that we have happening here, we have working machines because we're lucky to have those. If you don't have a sewing machine, if you're able to get one key to success is making sure that the machine is in good working order. You can always bring it to a service center or a craft store that does that, and they'll make sure that it's running for you. That way, when you have kids working on it, you're going to eliminate a lot of potential problems. You'll need thread for this, some seats to sit on. You can maybe see on the hooks behind there, I've got scissors hanging up. Again, those are good sharp scissors because that makes everything a lot easier. And any notions, and that just means things like buttons or measuring tape or pins or things like that that you might want to keep around the sewing center. My sign in the middle there, it has examples on the blue part. I just sewed what every stitch pattern looks like. So when students are sitting down to work at it, they can see exactly what they can choose what they want their project to look like. And they have a lot of fun experimenting with that. The QR code that's on there, when students, if students scan it, it links to a video that I actually had another student do a demonstration of how a sewing machine works, because of course, sometimes they get tired of listening to me, or it's more fun to listen to a kid at your school. And so I had a student do that. So sewing on cloth with the sewing machine. For this first project, this was one of the first days that we had the sewing machines in the classroom, and I wanted everyone to get to do something really simple and get to take it home that day. So these are bookmarks, and they're just made of 2 stacked pieces of fabric. You can fold over a ribbon or a cut piece of cloth or whatever you've got around if you want to, and put that in there. And this was at the very beginning of having them in my classroom. So one thing that we did was have the students run the foot pedal while I guided the fabric with my hands, and then they gradually took over as we were working until they felt like they could run the whole thing themselves. We were really fortunate, and perhaps you will be too, to get a donation of fabric samples. So those were things that were a little bit too small to be scarves or blankets or anything like that. But since it's just a rectangle of fabric, this was one of our favorite projects because all you have to do is fold that rectangle of fabric in half, sew a straight seam along one edge, and then the students made cowls or infinity scarves. These were a super huge hit for a kid to be able to make something themselves and walk out of the room wearing it. They got to pick out of a bunch of different fabric. They got to sew it themselves. And that's the kind of thing that a kid could go home wearing, and the adults are like, how did you make that? Like the people at home might never have done something like that. So that is a project that is evergreen because it's so fun. The kids always come out with new things, and it's really cool. So another thing, as we continue to level up in project difficulty here, another fun thing to work on is dimensional objects. So something like a pillow or a stuffy. For this, you'll need, of course, some cloth, needle and thread, stuffing, buttons, if that's where you're going, and some heavy paper to make a pattern. So here is some felt that I used for this. The owl shape is, I just used a manila folder and cut that shape out of it. So students could lay it down on the felt, maybe trace it with chalk to cut it out, 2 layers of that. And here are the students working on it. They had some different things that they made here. What they're working on, and again, this is the surface design on the top layer of cloth, they're sewing on buttons and details before they sew the edges together and stuff it. The students who made these were between 2nd grade and 4th grade, and they made these pretty much on their own. So you may find that straight craft fits into, especially if you're in an elementary school art room or if you're in an elective class, but you may also find that you want to bring in artists, art history, or you want to be connecting more of what you're already doing in the curriculum with the things that you're introducing in sewing. So I decided to bring in Miro because it's a big favorite, and talk about line and the element of line with my students. So as we were beginning to sew, students want to work on the machine one at a time, and I needed to think of a project where all of the rest of the class could be busy and engaged and doing something productive and art related. Well, those students were working on the machine. So here's how we set this up. You can see one of my students is sewing here, and this was, again, at one of the first times that they had done it. So we weren't sewing anything amazing or that we're going to show anybody else. So we're really just exploring the idea of organic line and using the sewing machine as something that you can make lines with. You can just use a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch or whatever is on there, and really gently make curves. We learned techniques like how to turn the fabric and how to gently guide it so it doesn't get tangled. But students were just really instructed to think about the Miro paintings that we had looked at, the way that he used line, and try to replicate some of that in the lines that they were making on the sewing machine. So while they were doing that, the other students were using markers and construction paper crayons at first to do a really organic line, however they saw fit. They were really encouraged to spread out bigger than they normally would, and then pick some of the spots to add color. So these two projects went together. In the end, what we did with that canvas that he's sewing there was we cut them up and we made them into earrings. And I would like to talk about troubleshooting and some things to remember. Hot tips. So everybody is going to make gnarly mistakes. Like I said at the beginning, everybody is going to make a mistake at some point. There's going to be a terrible knot. There's going to be something you don't know how they did it. Your student, instead of making a running stitch, will have made some crazy whip stitch, and now the whole embroidery hoop is tangled in it, something that you just don't even know how to start with. Everybody will do it. It is okay. Just plan in plenty of extra time, especially when you're introducing these things for yourself and for your students' sake as well. There's just going to be some things to figure out together. So just give yourself that extra time. Working in short bursts prevents frustration, and especially dependent on the age or the learning abilities of your students. Some students are really a lot more prone to frustration, and who can blame them? If you're really excited about sewing, you want your project to come out really cool, making a mistake that you don't know how to fix can just seem like a terrible disaster. So giving them small manageable tasks in short bursts is a really good way to prevent that frustration, to keep them excited about the unit that you're teaching and the project that they're working on. And it's always a good idea to just say, like, okay, you did this one part, now you can go work on the sewing cards, or now you can take a walk around the room, see what other kids are coming up with, get ideas from each other. You can see in the top corner that one of my students here tried to sew not with the thread, but with the needle itself, and snapped it off, which I didn't know was possible. So I thought that was something really funny I had to share with you. Try out projects in small groups first. You are going to learn a lot if you're introducing a new topic, something really physical like this, about both how you teach and how you need to set this up so that everybody in the room can feel successful and engaged. So if you have the opportunity to try it out in an elective or in an art club or in a homeroom situation, or if you even just work with small groups if you run a tab classroom, that is a good way to sort of scaffold the project for everybody and make sure that there's time enough to figure out how you best want to approach it. Student ambassadors are also one of my top ways that I'm able to do this with a full class at a time. And what I mean by that is students who have already figured out how to do something and are happy to help somebody else. So in this picture, you can see this was a 3rd grade student. He was so excited about the sewing machine, he asked for extra time to come in and use it, which of course. He also went home and asked if he could get a sewing machine at home, which they obliged. So when he came in to help me in my class, he's really excited about the sewing projects that he's been working on there. And he's really happy to show the other kids all this cool stuff that he knows how to do. So again, sometimes they get tired of listening to me or following my instructions, and they would really just rather learn from each other. So having students help each other out or work in pairs is a great way to do that. Okay, and that is my talking for the moment. I know that you probably have a lot of questions, and I bet you also have some ideas for connections, things that ideas you might want to toss around. So right now we're going to go ahead and open up the chat. Let me get out of here and let me open that up. Okay, so the first question is, what model Janome sewing machine? And they're called New Home. You can find those on Amazon for probably under $70. They come in different colors, so you'll find them listed for some reason under the color, but the model is Janome New Home. And that's something that my students have also, some of them have actually gotten machines at home to use, and they're really user-friendly. So as long as someone is there to guide them through setting up the machine and getting the thread going, then they're able to run it by themselves. I don't see another question for the moment, so this is a very good time to tell you a little bit more about how I did these projects. So I'm going to demonstrate. Here's my sewing card as promised. And here is a very well-used, well-loved plastic needle. So I've got this piece of yarn, and here's how I set these all up in advance so that students can get going as soon as they walk in the room. I put a knot at one end, and in the other end, thread this needle. If it gets a little funky, that is okay, it's yarn. And I tie it just once to the needle. When I'm teaching students to sew, I teach them, instead of pulling the needle, to pinch this yarn double right here and pull that instead. And that will help the kids from pulling the needle right off the yarn. And so here's how this works, and this is the basic of all sewing. You just pick a spot, you come from underneath, pull your needle up, and you'll know to stop when the knot touches the fabric or the paper. You go down through the next spot, up through the next one, and in a moment you're going to notice the dotted line that is characteristic of the running stitch. I always find it best practice to demonstrate to students some mistakes that they're going to make, so that normalizes it for them. And then we can talk about how to fix it. So one mistake that all the kids are going to make at some point is, instead of coming up here, as is the pattern, they're going to go around, do an accidental whip stitch around the outside. Uh-oh, the pattern is messed up. They don't know why. What are we supposed to do? So you just show them, go back where you came from, come back out, and you can get started again. All right, so that is the running stitch. If you want to teach students the back stitch, I'm going to start that and show you how that goes. And it's called the back stitch simply because after you come up, you take a step backwards. So back into the previous hole. That looks like this. Skip 2 spaces and come on through. That is the back stitch. It's really satisfying because it makes a solid line, and that's how that goes. So there's the running stitch, the back stitch, and that is how we use a sewing card and these plastic needles. I'm going to go ahead with the next question. I'll read it out loud in case you can't see the chat box. I teach at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation and detention center, and I know you mentioned how safe they are for students with the plastic guard, and slow speed keeps kids safe. However, are they easy to have items taken apart like the guard to access and take the needle? And that is the kind of thing that we have to think about, and you know, it's our job to keep our students safe. I think with any machine that there's a risk that somebody could take it apart. It would be pretty hard specifically to get at that needle, but any machine is able, because you have to be able to take it apart for service. You would be able to unscrew the parts, for example, if you had a screwdriver, and take out the metal parts that are in there. There may be some even more basic sewing machines, and I think a craft store would be a good place to look for those. I think there are some that don't even have a metal needle. I don't have a source on that, but I think that would be the thing to look for if you're really concerned about making sure that everybody stays safe, because that is a concern a lot of us come across. And we do want to be able to bring sewing to everybody. I'll go ahead and show you. One thing that I have for early finishers also is just an extra embroidery hoop. I say early finishers, but I also mean my friends who are getting a little frustrated and maybe need to look at something that isn't their own project for a moment. So I just have an extra one going. If they want to try something out or just look at something new, they can always do this. So I have some examples of things my students have been figuring out. And I did say I would show you how to sew on a button, that crucial life skill that happens to us all. So I've got a big old plastic button right here. And for this one, I'm using, because you have to think about the size of the holes. So I'm using this metal needle, and in my classroom, we call these jumbo pokey stabbers, because it is you are able to get poked on this one. I teach in an elementary school classroom, so I'm sure if you are a high school teacher, you're not going to say that to your students. All right. So back in the very old days, there were all of these very stern rules about things like how to sew on a button. And there were many steps to it, and it turned many people off of sewing forever. But here's how it goes, and it's very simple. All you have to do with this button is to stack it on top of your fabric. You just come up from behind here through that hole. So can you see that the needle is coming through the hole? Pull it up, down into the other one. And that's the long and short of it. You could do it twice if there's room. If you're using a thinner thread, you can. And then you just tie a knot at the back. And that's all there is to that. So that's just good to have in your back pocket if you lose a button off a shirt, or if you want to teach children how to sew eyeballs onto their stuffed animal. I'm wondering if anyone else has questions. I'm always happy to talk about more project ideas or applications for things you could do in your class. I'll throw out a few more times that students have been working on this in my class. Sometimes they have challenges from other teachers, like there's a project they do each year where they need to turn a plastic soda bottle into a person from history because they're doing biography. And so I have kids in my room sewing tiny felt jackets for their liter soda bottle and things like that. Do you teach other stitches to your elementary students? I usually start with those two, but then if students are interested, I'll show them how to combine those things, or how to do things that might be a little fancier. I just absolutely love embroidery, and I could never get enough of it. So I'm always happy if a kid is interested to teach them how to do some more things. So you can see on here, for example, that they were doing this asterisk design. And so the way that we did that is just to talk about how to combine lines, the same as you would if you're drawing, because it's basically drawing with yarn. how to break things down into the parts and do it a little bit at a time. Because my students are small, I usually stop there, but then we might talk about other stitches. Let's see. Like we might do, I'm trying to think, we just finished one where students were doing a border. So anything that makes a good border stitch, which could be anything backstitch based. Like so. But I've also asked the students to think about other ways that they could use their fine motor skills and just do small things at a time. So they might do something with a bit of a chain stitch to it, by which I mean this. Act like you're back stitching, and then you just come back here and put your needle under that last stitch ever so gently so you don't pull very tight, and then go back in where you came from. And so you can probably see on there that it's forming a tiny piece of a chain, and that is something that you can repeat as much as you want. So now it goes under the two legs of that stitch, gently, and back into that same spot you came from. And after a few tries, it's not a terribly hard one to master, especially if you're working with older students who have a longer length of focus or more of an interest in surface design, like that. So that's something that, like I said, older students, if you are doing something with high school students, if you're doing anything with costuming or clothing design, or if you want to have them, as is sort of the hit right now, doing like paintings and embroidery. I've seen a lot of those coming out recently from young artists. So stitches like that might be something that really hold their interest. The question is, have you had success with adding beading? That is a really good question. If my students were a little bit older, I would absolutely do that. As it is, they're a little bit small, but I can tell you that my adult students have had great success with adding beading. And I don't have a bead here right with me to show you, but I'll just tell you that beading is like this. If you're just going ahead and doing your stitches, but you're putting beads onto your needle and sliding them down. So as you're creating a decoration, you're also adding beads to that decoration, which is really lovely. And that's something, oh boy, all of your students who love a really fine project or who like to get mesmerized by something close to their face or something repetitive, beading is a terrific idea. That's a real hit. I wonder, are there any questions about ways that you could fit it into with your particular students, or into maybe artists that you really like to teach? Okay, well, that might be all of the questions that folks have. Are there anything, other topics that anyone would like me to speak to, or ideas with things that you found successful in your art room?
Oh, there's one.
Oh, terrific. Thank you, Isabel. In case anyone can't see the chat box, I will read it. Most of my kids do love working with crafts such as crochet. Oh my gosh, awesome. I'm currently trying to incorporate weaving and knitting. Oh yeah, all of those. Those are really big hits. One way that we do crochet in my classroom, because I don't have a class set of crochet hooks, is we actually use the same yarn, and this is something that I've done with the younger students. As I mentioned at the beginning, many of these students who I'm showing, they're really fantastic projects. I've been working with them for several years now. So we might start with a yarn project to get them comfortable with these materials, even before we ever take out needles or talk about sewing. So one way that we do crochet is for just using the same kind of fat yarn, make a slip knot and just do, we call it finger knitting, but it's really crochet, and make a chain. And that's something that my kids have gotten a lot out of. They've been really excited once we take out the sewing materials, because they're using something familiar and getting to make something new out of it. Isabel, I think that's a great idea. Weaving and knitting are huge hits in my classroom, and we've done that with a lot of different materials. And again, I'll read this out loud because I don't know if everyone can see the chat box. Seeing if we can add the sewing, because it's such a valuable skill that we need. Since we don't allow kids to have or use technology, they have a better appreciation for these things because we don't always get to teach. Absolutely, and I think that's really interesting to hear about. At my school, it's a very tech-focused school, so sometimes I feel I have to bring a lot of tech into the art room, but at the same time, I think it's really valuable for kids to have a break from that, and to be able to have real materials in their hands and know where those come from. So one way that I've bridged that gap sometimes is to talk to the students about, if there's a big push now for coding in schools. And as many of us know, early coding was really based on weaving looms and weaving patterns. So that's something that I've incorporated to try to have them do offline coding by creating patterns and binary sequences in their weaving. I'll read these out loud again. I don't know if everyone can see it. I've always been amazed at how quiet and focused students are when working with thread and yarn. Absolutely, it's a startling, beautiful thing to me to see. There's all this fuss at the beginning of, oh, I need help, this is messed up, I don't know if I'm doing this right. And then there's this moment where everybody gets in the groove, and it reminds me very much of a knitting circle where everyone's got a pattern in front of them and they're chatting, and then there's this real quiet moment where everybody's just in the swing of things, and there's like a group momentum and to that calm and that focus. Leah says, I teach a sewing class at the Boys and Girls Club, and the kids loved making emoji stuffies. That is really cool. That was mostly ages 6 to 8. I also had kids create their own flavor of Pop-Tart once and create a design for that and create it in 3D with sewing. Whoa, a combo of stuffy, applique, and puff paint, ages 9 to 12. That is really cool, and that's also a great example of just, meet the kids where they're at and what they're interested in. Any materials that you've got around you, or you're going to be able to bring those in. So puffy paint is a really cool way to be adding detail and things on there. The next question is, have you ever tried adding LED lights and simple circuits to your sewing projects so they light up? I've seen some projects like that. Yes, we did give that a try. I had a grand idea that I did not have quite the tech skill to pull off, but we did try it. And I've seen some really incredible light up LED things coming out of design schools and at fashion shows. And that's a really cool thing to be able to do. If you can get your hands on, conductive wire and lights and the things that you need, that's a really cool idea. That could be something that students are wearing. Maybe you have an opportunity for them to show off in front of other kids and get to show at sort of a mini fashion show what they're doing. Or if you wanted to video with them, so even if you could only have it on briefly, people could share. But that's a really incredible project. And as I was saying at the beginning, it's a, you know, sewing is a real STEAM activity. That's something that anybody who enjoys manipulating things, putting things together, finding out how things work, there's just room in the world of sewing for all of that innovation. And what a cool way to meet kids, you know, right where their interests are. Since I had a not very smart experience with it, I will say that that's one of those things where you want to try it with a small group and really make sure that you've got the hang of it. That was one of the valuable things I learned in my teaching practice from trying that out without enough prototyping beforehand. But it's also the kind of thing where sometimes I'll do a design challenge with my students and say, okay, now that you've got these skills, I can put this variety of materials in front of you and here's the challenge, and see what they come up with. Because I can only imagine if students who were familiar with circuitry had something like that in front of them, just how many cool things would come out of it. I also love Leah's idea about the cool designs that she did at the Boys and Girls Club. I love showing off things like that when we have any opportunity for an art show or bulletin board or anywhere that we show work, because I might have done a project with one grade or one class, and when everyone else sees it, they come in, they're like, can we do that? Can we sew? And everybody's really excited about it. And that's really part of making, you know, at my school, making a culture for sewing and the expectation that everyone's going to get to learn it and try it and have something new to add. Are there any, I don't know anyone's background who's here at this webinar, but are there any techniques that I could demonstrate right now that would help anyone feel like they were ready to get started with their projects? Did I have the kids trace their initials for the embroidery? We were on a time crunch, so I did it for them. But I think if I were to repeat that, I would let them do it, because it was really apparent to me once I started seeing their work that I wasn't sure at the beginning what their level of excitement was going to be, how long they would really be interested and engaged in the project. And so I was trying to sort of get that part out of the way. But in the future, now that I know how much they're willing to put into it, I would have them do it themselves. I think that they would be a lot more, there would be a lot more ownership over their piece. When they showed it off to other people, it was sort of apparent like which part I had done. And I think in the future, I would let them do that themselves and help them along the way. I think the sewing cards are great for littles. Yeah, it took me a long time to come to it. I kept starting on cloth and then thinking, oh God, like there's a real learning curve here. But once I figured out that we don't have to be using cloth all the time, the sewing on paper became something that we do a lot of. So I'll have these holes punched and just have a stack of sewing cards out when I have a sewing elective. And that lets students really, once they have, they've got it down what the stitches are, I tell them, okay, like here are all the colors, here are the materials, we have string, we have yarn, you know what to do. And how many different ways can you think of to connect these things, and how many patterns can you make just by using the sewing card? And because it's so small, it gives students, you know, you're not gonna go astray. You can't really mess it up very badly. So it gives them a lot of freedom and confidence to try stuff out on something small. And then when we move on to something else, they always feel like those are skills that they can transfer and ideas that they can transfer onto doing a larger project, or one with materials that are a little, that aren't as easy to use. The question is, do I have a choice classroom? Or if not, how much time do I spend with fibers per grade each year? Do you do multiple projects? So it varies per grade. I try to, when I set up my curriculum for the year, make sure that everyone has at least one big fibers project. And it's not always sewing. I also cover weaving, sometimes wet felting. We do embroidery and a few different things. So I don't have a choice classroom. We do a project all together. That being said, one of the projects that I make sure to set up for everyone each over the course of the school year is something where they're going to use the skills that I've already taught them in a previous project, but they're going to find a way to answer a challenge using what they've got. For example, I might, the project with turning their biography buddies, turning a soda bottle into a person. So I might say to them, like, you know how to sew, so how are you going to answer this design challenge using that? We do sometimes do more than one fibers project a year because they love it and I love it. And when I every so often put out centers, it's always the biggest one. My third graders are currently lobbying for the sewing center to always be open every day for a finisher center. So we're going to see how that goes. That may even be good for older students as well who have never learned how to sew. I know with my kids it'd be really good since they're behaviorally at a younger level than middle and high school. Yeah. Yes, and this is also something, you know, not all of us have built up a huge selection of tools or have the budget to buy a class set of embroidery hoops or something right off the bat. But if you can get some heavy paper, I cut this out of manila folders. If you have cardboard from boxes, if you can use any of those things, then this is the kind of thing that's really like, whether your students have behavioral issues, fine motor issues, learning issues, it's something that everybody can feel successful at. So that's really great to hear that that's something people have used or would use across different age ranges and to meet a whole variety of learners. I will also say the students that I work with now, I work at a small private school. And so the population that I work with is very different from when I taught sewing in North Philadelphia in the school district. But a project like this was just how we started it out then. And even though I didn't have all of the same supplies available to me, it was really great with still teaching all of the kids great sewing skills. Oh, this is a great idea from Leah. Check with your local furniture store if you want free scrap fabric. When they retire patterns, they discard the samples. That is awesome to know, and that's a really great way to get supplies. If you can get any fabric donated to you, sometimes people will have that just sitting in their attic, the same as a sewing machine might be up there, just waiting to be given away if somebody asks for it. There might be somebody who, you know, has a haul from the reclaimed store or who has something left over from a project. There might be someone from a furniture store or whatever is in your area. If you ask them, it's, you know, as you know, our teachers, people are surprisingly generous with giving you materials if you let them know that they are for students. Well, as we're coming to a close here, oh, I'm sorry, there's another tip. Students really enjoy sewing on pattern fabric because they can follow the images. Yes, that's fantastic. Students can trace that. If you have students who are brand new to sewing and you give them a scaffold like that, that's just a really guaranteed way that they can feel successful right off the bat. That's a great idea.
All right, and it looks like we are getting close to the end. So if anybody has any more questions for Johanna, now is the time. A lot of great information.
Yeah, these are fantastic tips and ideas. Thank you so much, everyone. If anyone would like to be in touch on social media, that is a fantastic way for us to give each other tips, let each other know what kinds of things we tried, what's successful, anything that we would like to share. I would just love to hear from what you do in your classrooms.
All right, well, that looks like that's about it on the questions. Oh, there's one more. Oh, it's more of a thank you.
Oh, thank you, Michelle.
Yes, Fibers is having a real comeback. This was a good one.
It's a beautiful moment to be alive, truly.
Yes. All right, well, we'll go ahead and start to wrap this up. We really hope that everyone enjoyed your time with us tonight, and we have two more quick things before we go. First, we want to share the registration link for our next WebinART, which is blended and online learning for authentic art experiences with PAEA past president Robin Brewer. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that into the chat in case anybody's interested. So there's that link. And remember, you can always find out where all of our events to register for. They're always on the PAEA sponsored, the PAEA website calendar, the PAEA Facebook pages, and also emails from either me, PAEA's Director of Programming, or your division or region reps. If you have not signed the chat roll for your Act 48 information, please make sure you put your name there so we can get you the link to ensure that your participation was checked. And unless there's any other questions popping up, then I believe that's a wrap, unless there's any more questions. All right, good night, everyone.
Good night, thank you so much.